Hello, everyone, and welcome to our week 2 of organizational theory. And I'm very happy to be with you again today. And for this week's lecture, we are going to be covering two chapters, chapters 2 and chapter 3 of the textbook. I hope that you enjoyed our first week. I hope that you found it interesting, and I'm sure that you're going to find this week's topic and this week's conversation also very interesting. So let's get started. Okay, so for this week's topic, we are looking at other concepts, other elements of organizations, and we're going to be looking at the stakeholders, the different stakeholders that an organization has. We're also going to be looking at things, for example, like moral hazard. Sometimes what happens when you have information asymmetry, and then what is what can management do about it, right? What can we as managers, whether we're talking about private organizations or public sector organizations, what can managers do to try and mitigate some of these risks and some of these negative impacts or potential pitfalls that could drive an organization into a dangerous situation. So let's look at the organization's stakeholders. Who are the stakeholders in an organization? Well, stakeholders, as you know, are those that have an interest or a claim or a stake, right, in the organization. Generally speaking, when we're talking about private organizations, like, for example, a firm, we're talking about stockholders. So if you own shares of stock, you are a stakeholder. But it's not just the stockholders, of course. You have clients, you have customers, you have investors, you have creditors, you have even other competitors who share the same industry, right? Because you also have to manage competition and have to protect, for example, your reputation and the industry as well. So those could be stakeholders from a private sector perspective. From a public sector perspective, we are talking about government. We're talking about whether that's federal, state, or local. We are talking about voters, right? So your citizens are stakeholders, and of course the providers or those that you contract or subcontract to provide a service or to perform a service that the public organization is required to perform. So those are stakeholders. Then we have something called inducements, and these are rewards for doing something, whether that be money, power, or organizational status. So an inducement is what drives people within an organization to act a certain way. Then you have contributions, okay, and this is where those that make up the organization add value to the organization. This includes skills, your knowledge, right? So if you have an expertise in an area, well, you bring that expertise to the organization and it adds value. So this is that part of the organization. So we have stakeholders, inducements, and contributions. Okay, so let's look a little bit here for a minute at the inducements and contributions. Just some examples very quickly, right? We have, for example, if you look on the left-hand side here, you have the stakeholder, you have shareholders, you have managers, you have the workforce. And what is the contribution of these different actors? Well, shareholders provide money and capital. Managers provide their skill set and their expertise. And the workers also provide skills and expertise. What is the inducement required for this contribution? For the stakeholders, we're talking about dividends, right? In many, especially if you know some accounting, You know that you have common stock and you have preferred stock, right? So the common stock owner gets dividends, right? Um, and in fact, preferred stock get dividend also, but uh, the if you own shares in a company, you're looking for dividends and you're looking for the stock to go up in value. So that's the inducement. If you're a manager, you're looking for salary, right? Salary, bonuses for maybe reaching a milestone or achieving some objective, right? You're also looking for status and power. As you grow in an organization, you want advancement. You want to go up in the ladder, right? And so you seek that status, and you seek power. And by the way, power sometimes gets a negative connotation, gets a negative bad rap. Power is not necessarily bad. It's what we do with the power that is ultimately bad or good, right? But power is required. It's a necessity for an organization to be able to achieve its objectives. We won't talk too much about power in this presentation, but we'll talk about it later on in the class. The workforce, on the other hand, they contribute with their skills and their expertise, and in exchange, they get wages. They're paid wages, maybe a bonus, right? Job security. That's very, very important for workers. And then maybe every now and then a promotion, right? So these are the shareholders, the managers, the workforce. Outside, you have other stakeholders. You have customers, suppliers, government, unions, the community in general, and the community, and then general public. And each of these, as you can see, and I won't read them all, but you can certainly read these on your own, and also read in the chapter the contributions that each of these stakeholders make to the organization, and the inducement that is necessary to achieve the desired result, right? Okay. Now, turning the page a little bit here. How do we achieve this? How do we make sure that the organization satisfies the stakeholders' goals and interests? Because you see, if you think about government, if you think about the private sector, you have investors, you have stockholders, you have clients, you have customers, you have the government. You have all of these different stakeholders, and every single stakeholder has a desired outcome. They each are motivated by a specific goal that is specific to them. So how do you satisfy these goals that often become competing goals, right? And so it's not an easy thing to do, right? It's not an easy thing to do. So finding the right way to evaluate the effectiveness of the organization becomes a challenge for organizations, especially when we're talking about public sector organizations, which are not driven by, say, the bottom line. They're not driven by profit maximization. They are not driven by market share. They are not driven by value of the stock. They are not driven by that. They are driven by providing a good or service that is required by law, and also meeting the needs of the citizens, and doing it within the legal framework, sometimes even the constitutional framework. And of course, the bottom line for public sector officials is getting elected and reelected, right? So that's kind of where the rubber hits the road when you're talking about the public sector, right? Are you providing the good or service so that John Doe citizen is happy and gives you his or her vote of confidence in a ballot box, right? So how do you satisfy stakeholder goals? This becomes a very important and difficult challenge for organizations. So let's look at some of these. For example, in a private organization, we are talking about for example, return on investment, ROI. You might have heard about this acronym, this expression, return on investment. An investor will invest money in a company, and they expect a return on that investment. If we are talking about the client or the customer, you you look at effectiveness. You judge effectiveness based on the quality of the product. Okay, how good is the product? Uh, how good is the car, right? You bought a brand new Mercedes. Did it meet your expectations? You heard about Mercedes Benz and quality, right? And the ultimate, I think it's BMW is the ultimate driving machine. But you hear, all these commercials, and the prestige and the wonderful things about these very fine luxury automobiles. Well, when you buy it, you come to some conclusion, and whether your expectations are met or not, and that will determine whether you are going to buy another car, another Mercedes. Are you going to, it's going to have an impact on the sales, right? On the sales of the company. If customers are satisfied. If customers are not satisfied, then it's going to have a negative impact. Okay, so the quality of the product is one way that you measure effectiveness. Another way that other stakeholders measure effectiveness is for example, managers and employees in terms of compensation. Am I being adequately and fairly compensated for my skills, for my job, for my effort, for my know-how, right? Are the conditions appropriate? Are they safe? Are they worthy of my position, right? Career prospects, right? Do I have a chance to grow in the organization, right? So these are things that managers and employees look at, but then of course there's always the other question is how to allocate organizational rewards to different stakeholders, right? Because organizations make money, organizations provide a service, organizations achieve power or achieve status, or some kind of objective is met. And when you meet that objective, there's usually gains, right? There's value added, and it may come in the form of financial wealth or stock shares of stock, or it may come in terms of the prestige, or in terms of, say, moving up in the political ladder, or becoming somebody that's politically very, a superstar. So how do you allocate these organizational rewards to different stakeholders? Okay, it's not easy, and the reason it's not easy, as we said in the past, is because we have competing goals often in organizations, right? Organizations exist to satisfy stakeholders' goals, okay? But how do you determine which ones are most important, right? And a lot of it has, the one way, or at least a lot of it has to do with the authority. How much authority you have, and who calls the shots, right? Who determines, who has the power to to um, to determine where those extra benefits or those rewards are going to go to. Who determines that? And a lot of it has to do with the structure of the organization, and who has the authority to make those decisions. Authority is the power to essentially to reward and to punish, right? And you hold people accountable, and you can do that with rewards and with punishments. Okay, in a firm, for example, the authority rests in the hands of the shareholders. They are the owners of the company. The common stockholders are the owners of a company, and so if they decide that the board of directors and the CEO and the GM need to go, then that's what they decide, and those decisions are taken and met. And the people vote, and that's that. Okay? When it comes to public organizations, it's a little bit more complicated. Now, in organizations, there exists, because we have competing goals, and because organizations by nature are they're these systems. They are it's like a living organism. An organization is like this living organism that has many different elements, right? So you have all these different stakeholders, you have many different levels, you have an objective, a main objective, a key objective, but within that key objective, you have underlying processes and systems that have to work in conjunction to be able to meet that objective. And what ends up happening when you have a lot of people together working on trying to achieve a goal, you might end up in different times with a problem that's called the moral hazard problem. Okay, and the moral hazard is a phenomenon of organizations and of economics and of really of society. We just don't find moral hazard in an organization. We find it in society in many different aspects, many different arenas. Where does it exist? Where does the moral hazard exist, and why does it exist? Well, it exists because there's asymmetry of information. That means that information is not perfect. Somebody knows more than you do. Somebody has the upper hand because they have knowledge of something that you don't have knowledge of. Okay? So it exists. A principal finds it very difficult to evaluate how the agent has performed because the agent possesses an information advantage. So it's the famous principal agent problem. And so you have the principal, the agent, and you don't know everything about about the agent, and about what the agent has done to perform a certain way, and so it becomes very difficult and sometimes even impossible to punish or reward appropriately and fairly and efficiently. Okay, leaving the agent with an advantage. Okay, because of the agent has essentially an incentive to pursue goals and objectives that may not necessarily be aligned with the principal's goals and objectives. Okay. So, before we get to solving the problem, think about this example, say from the public sector and also from the private sector. So, from the private sector, think about a manager who is a general manager, or a GM. Okay, a general manager, and the general manager uh, receives receives a bonus for maximizing sales. Say for example, if the company reaches a sales plateau, or a sales target of say 5 million units, the general manager receives $100,000 in bonus, as an example. So the general manager might, in the objective and in his or her attempt and desire to achieve that sales goal, he or she might pursue selling units to individuals who may not be able to, say, pay for those units in the long run. Maybe their credit rating is not as good as the company would like it to be. And so, but the manager decides that they are going to be much more flexible in selling say, for example, houses or cars. We're going to sell used cars, and we're going to lower our credit standards so that more individuals are qualify for loans. And so essentially you're going to sell thousands and millions of cars, and you're going to get to that goal, and you're going to make your bonus but you're doing it because you are reducing or the requirement for credit. And so your actions are going against the best interests of the firm for long-term sustainability and credit, because what's going to end up happening is you're going to sell, but half of those sales are going to go into default, which are going to result in losses for the company in the future because you're going to incur these uncollectible accounts. Well, that's going to be the company suffering, but the manager has his or her bonus because they reached that plateau. So that's an example of the principal agent problem and this moral hazard problem acting itself out when the agent acts to achieve something that's personal, and the principal has a hard time making sure that that doesn't happen. Okay, because they don't control all the information. With politics, it could be very simple as a politician acting on her behalf or his behalf just so that they can get reelected, even though it's going to end up uh, causing more harm to the public, for example. Or maybe it's going to end up hurting the party in general. But he or she will decide that they are going to go their way so that they can maximize their own benefit, right? So, how do you control against this? Or how does a company or government, a government agency, how do you control against something like this? Well, you have to devise what we call governance mechanisms, okay, and these are embedded or in they're created. They almost act as limits um, to make sure that the actions of the individuals working for the organization do follow and do align with the organization's ultimate goals, right, and the expectations, whether that's a public firm or public agency or a private firm. So for private firm, you might have, for example, stock-based compensation schemes. So these are monetary rewards that the company might give management in the form of stocks or stock options. These are linked to company performance, and so a manager cannot go against anything that would harm company performance, whether that's the value of the stock, shares of stock, or return on investment, what have you. The manager cannot do anything that would be counter to that, because if she or he does that, they would be acting against their own self-interest, right? So the companies, private companies, will usually incorporate this into into management's reward package or compensation package to make sure that they do act in benefit of the company and themselves at the same time. As far as public companies or public, I shouldn't say companies, but public agencies and government, the way that they control this is um, by it's a little bit different there. It has to do with your reputation within the party and how much support you're going to receive from your constituents and also from party members. Whether those are higher up in the echelon. Say for example, if you're a senator and you are acting against what the party wants you to do, say that abandoned the party platform, you have crossed the line, um, you have done something that the party did not want you to do. Well, what's going to happen is you're going to get punished by the party, the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. We're seeing that, in fact, play out in our current state of affairs in the U.S. with some of our elected officials, right? And so there's ways where in politics and in government you can, in fact, be punished for acting in a way that does not align with your with the organization. In this case, it would be the political party, or acting not in the best interests of the people, the constituents, your the polity, right? Those that elected you, and then acting on your behalf. Doing something that you shouldn't be doing, something that's unethical, something that's illegal, etc. Okay, and so on that note, right? Ethics plays a central role in organizations, and it is in fact a required ingredient for an organization to be able to function properly. It's not just something that we want; it's something that is necessary. We need. It's a necessary ingredient in organizations. But human beings are they're human, and not everybody is ethical, and not everybody is righteous, and so you end up with many instances where ethical dilemmas arise. Okay, and what is an ethical dilemma? Okay, well, it's when you have to decide on acting. Do I do this? It's going to hurt me, but it's the right thing to do, or do I do this because I can't do? If I don't do it, and I'm going to be personally affected, right? If I do this, it's gonna help my adversary. So should I not say anything? Should I keep quiet? Right? The famous do I keep quiet? Do I talk? Do I turn somebody in? These are ethical dilemmas, right? And certainly they're not easy. And that's why they're called dilemmas, because they are not easy decisions. And of course, we as Christians believe that the ultimate judge knows everything, and knows where our heart is. And you might fool people, but you're not going to fool God. So, thinking a little bit more mundane here, one way that organizations try and reduce the unethical behavior is by creating a code of ethics, right? And so organizations usually have their code of ethics, and again, it's not easy to arrive at a code of ethics, because not everybody agrees on what is right or wrong, right? But organizations still do pursue their code of ethics, and many times these codes of ethics are just reflections of the greater environment, which we'll talk about here in a minute. Most if you're doing business in the United States, the U.S. has a certain code of ethics. If you're doing business in, say, a country that is, for example, an Islamic country, the code of ethics might encompass certain religious elements that would not be included in another country. So it depends on the external environment as to what that code of ethics is. Okay. Now, in this picture here, you might be wondering, who is this? Who is this guy? Okay. Well, this is Immanuel Kant. Okay. Immanuel Kant, and Kant, famous for his Kantian ethics, or some might know him as deontological ethics. It's interesting, and the reason I have him here is because what is ethical and what is not ethical sometimes depends on the ethical framework that you are using to decide whether something is ethical or not. And in deontological ethics, which is the one that Kant promoted, deontology, the word deontological comes from dios, and dios is duty. It means duty. So we have a duty to act ethically, and what that means is, according to Kant, that no matter whether the action produced a positive result or a negative result, that was irrelevant. Something was ethical because it was the right thing to do. So if you did the right thing because we had a duty to do the right thing, however it turned out is irrelevant in that analysis to determine if it was ethical or not. That's contrary to the utilitarian ethical framework or ethical perspective, which does consider the end justifying the means, for example. And an action is deemed ethical if it produces the greatest good for the greatest number. Jeremy Bentham, for example. Um, and so, if you think about these two competing ethical perspectives, you might, as you go into work tomorrow, and as you live your lives, you might come across ethical dilemmas, and those dilemmas are going to look very differently depending on which of the two ethical lenses you put on. Do I act deontologically? Thou shalt not steal, no matter what you're going to use that whatever you stole. Say, for example, you stole food to give to a hungry child. That, according to Kant, is not ethical. No matter how honorable and how important and how justified you thought your reasoning was to steal, it's still stealing. And so it is not ethical. But if you look at it from a utilitarian perspective, it's perfectly ethical because the end justified the means. It's the Robin Hood effect, right? The fact that I'm taking money to give to the poor. I'm stealing this food so that I could feed this hungry child who hasn't eaten anything for 3 days, right? And so you see how the ethical dilemma is just there. I mean, it's right. It's there, right? What's the right thing to do? Not easy. Certainly not easy to come to that conclusion. Okay, and also another important part about ethics is that, when we think about ethics, sometimes we think that something that's ethical or a code of ethics is tantamount. By tantamount, I mean that it's comparable to, or it's represented by the law. What's legal? We ask ourselves, well, is it legal? Well, ethics and the law don't always go hand in hand, and legal does not always guarantee ethical. Okay, and we see in this picture, this is from the South during before the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This is the very unfortunate and terrible period in American history, the Jim Crow laws, etc., where you had, after the Plessy v. Ferguson decision in 1896 of separate but equal, you ended up with these types of situations, right? Colored waiting room, white waiting room. So you had the separate but equal. It was legal. It was constitutional, in fact. There was a decision by the Supreme Court that said separate can be equal, and it gave way to state laws in the South where it was perfectly legal to segregate. Well, today, thank the Lord, in 2022, we know that was a wrong, and we have tried to right that wrong. But again, it just goes to show you that legal does not guarantee, nor does it mean ethical. And we can see many examples throughout history in the United States and abroad of laws that have been unethical and immoral, and have allowed and promoted actions that are not only immoral and unethical to our standards, or to many people's standards, but also anti-Christian, right? Go against Christian values. Which for those of us that are Christians, it should be the driving, the central ethical code that we should follow and promote, right? So it's important to make that distinction, right? So ethics and the law don't always go hand in hand, and that's why it's important to question, and to be very clear as to what the spirit and the nature and the purpose of the law is, to see if it actually promotes sound ethics or not. as I said before, ethics is it comes from the external environment. We determine our ethics based on some guiding values, principles, morals, laws, customs, traditions, right? So we have different sources of ethics. You have societal ethics. These come from customs, from practices, thousands of years of culture, of history, of a certain moral code that's embedded and ingrained in a society, in a group. Okay. You also have professional ethics. For example, doctors. Doctors abide by a code that they are not to inflict harm. Right. The Socratic oath. Right. Um, and lawyers, right, also should abide by a code, right, not to interpret the law in a way that will cause unfair or illegal situations, what have you, right? Police officers, law enforcement in general, right? You are deputized, and you have a constitutional mandate because of the state power, the police power that the state grants you to use lethal force. Well, that comes with great responsibility, right? And so, how you interpret that power is essential to making sure that you abide by and that you are adhering to the highest possible professional ethics, because you're talking about human life, right? And then you have your individual ethics, and so you have the society, then you have the organization, and then you, and that's between you and your creator, right? This is your moral code. These are your standards, and that's essential, because if you think about the relationship between ethics and morality, ethics is the result of a collective morality, but your morals are yours. So Christians have our own moral values. Not everybody in society is Christian, and even within the Christians, not everybody has the same set of morals, right? Uh, and so every single one of us individually have our own moral code, and that is the ultimate guide as to how you're going to act and behave within an organization. So why is this important? Well, because we want to create, in an organization, we want to create a culture of ethics. We want to create an ethical organization, an ethical culture. Okay, organizations are like people, like an organism, and they can grow and be wonderful and do excellent things and add much value to society. They're part of the building blocks of society. But just like they can do great things, they can also do very terrible things, right? We can see in the history of humanity, the Nazi Party was an organization that could have done great things for Germany. Instead, it did horrible things, right? Not just for Germany, but for the world. So creating an ethical culture is essential, and it starts from the top, okay? The leadership, the organizational entrepreneurs, the founders of the organization have a huge responsibility to create the foundation for the ethics of the organization. From them is where those ethics are going to kind of dissipate into the soil, and from that soil you're going to reap what you sow, right? You're going to grow into a very ethical organization, or you're going to grow into a very a non-ethical organization, right? And so leadership becomes very important. The values and the morals and the standards of your leaders, and they are going to choose ethical and high character individuals to lead these organizations, to manage these organizations, and create an environment that ensures, promotes, protects ethics within the organization. Okay, so on that note, let's look at the organizational environment. Okay, the organizational environment, as you see here in the middle, you have the organization. The organization is surrounded by the elements that feed it, or that affect it, or that one interacts with. For example, government, customers, distributors, unions, competitors, suppliers. We talked about these. We call them the stakeholders. But outside of the stakeholders, you have the organizational environment, which is made up of all of these different forces, like demographics, international forces, right? Political forces, environmental forces, economic forces, technological forces. So when you think about the organization, for example, like the United States Senate, it's not just the U.S. Senate. It's not just those 100 senators. It's the 100 senators, the outside political environment. It's the relationship with the executive. It's the relationship with the judiciary. It's the relationship with the states. It's the relationship with each of their parties. It's the relationship with folks outside of the country. It's foreign policy. It's so many things, right? And all of these elements make up that organizational environment, which in many ways is driving the decisions that the organization makes, right? Organizations don't exist in a vacuum. They react, just like any organism, they react to its external environment. And so every organization will be acting based in some way, shape, or form on what's happening in its outside environment. Some of the factors that affect an organization and that cause uncertainty, and by the way, remembering that one of the reasons organizations exist and organize is so that they can mitigate risk. So risk comes from three main drivers or main sources, and the first one is complexity. The second one is dynamism. Okay, and the third one is financial resources. So, for example, in terms of complexity, it's simple to complex. If you're looking at a problem, is the problem simple or complex, right? How complex the problem will determine how much risk and how much uncertainty it generates. If we're talking about dynamism, stability to instability. So you think about our current situation in the U.S., the dynamic environment that decisions are made under today, given the uncertainty about COVID-19, the next variant, the inflation issue, the supply chains, the issues regarding China, other places in the world. I mean, you name it, right? And so all of that leads to unstable environments, right? So the stability of the external environment versus the instability of the external environment generates uncertainty, generates risk. And then the last one is, how are you going to be able to pay for everything, right? Are you going to be able to meet the sales forecast? Are you going to be able to get reelected, right? The current administration has that concern. If you are a senator, am I going to get reelected? Am I going to get kicked out of office, right? So do I have enough resources to do what I need to do so that I can achieve that reelection? A firm might ask, are we going to have enough resources to be able to grow in the way that we want to grow so that we can continue being number one in the industry? And so abundance to scarcity. How abundant are the resources that we need versus how scarce are the resources that we need? Organizations have different structures, right? And because of these different structures, and because they act and they react differently to the external environment, they sometimes have to act or form or follow a certain structure that gives them the best possible chance at surviving and thriving. So, for example, you might have an organization that seeks to go into a strategy, for example, of collusion, or maybe becoming part of a cartel, or finding a third party linkage. Okay, so what are these? Here in this picture you have the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, the OPEC. Okay, the OPEC, by the way, is comprised of oil producing countries, all of them Middle Eastern, with the exception of one, and that is Venezuela. Venezuela is the non-Arab member of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. They together determine the supply of oil in the world and hence the price of oil. Okay, they are a cartel. They colluded together to keep prices within a band and to make sure that the price did not just go down to the floor. And so this is their way of mitigating the risk that is inherent in the oil industry, for example. Other organizations, other companies, other firms might decide that it's best for them to collude or best for them to form a merger, right? You've heard about mergers and acquisitions, right? Daimler Chrysler, or what's another one? I'm trying to think about others that have merged recently, but I can't think of one. But there's been many examples of mergers in the U.S. and in the world. You might also find a third-party linkage where you are linking with, say, somebody that is somewhere in that supply chain. You're linking with somebody that can lower the cost of production or the distribution. Maybe somebody has a distribution network that you can tap into, and so you will link with them and they will help you distribute your product. Okay? In politics, third-party linkages happen all the time, and collusion happens all the time when political parties collude, when sometimes enemies become friends, right? In the U.S., we have a two-party system. So that's not as prevalent, but in other countries outside of the U.S., this is very common, where smaller parties will join a bigger party, and they will essentially become a bigger party, and that way they can achieve some higher degree of political power. Okay, so along these lines, right, you have strategic alliances. Okay. And mergers or takeovers, right? Sometimes a big company will take over a small company that's suffering or that's vulnerable or that needs help because it has no money. And so you have these mergers and takeovers, which are very common in the private sector especially. I think we're reaching the end here. Lastly, there's something called transactions cost theory. And what is transactions cost theory? Well, remember that organizations organize, and they do form because it becomes less costly for them to do so, meaning that the costs are shared by many and are spread out, and because you have a lot of information coming together, you are able to reduce the costs of transactions to its bare minimum. Well, this is transactions cost theory. It's how do you minimize the cost of negotiations, the cost of monitoring, the cost of exchange. Any exchange, any cost. Here you see FedEx, right? Think about, for example, you buy a set of earbuds, right? And so you buy that in Amazon, and you expect those earbuds to arrive at your door. Well, it doesn't happen magically, right? There's a cost of transactions that has to be incurred for those earbuds to arrive at your door, right? And so when it's the same with organizations, how does FedEx minimize those costs? Well, it's able to provide that service at a minimal cost because it has the network, it has the technology, it has the information, and it to be able to spread out the cost of that one transaction over thousands of transactions at the same time. And so it's able to provide that cost at a very very minimal cost. If it was just one person doing it, think about if you sold a table to somebody on eBay or sold it on on Facebook or what have you, you sold a table. you would have to negotiate with the buyer. Well, how much are you going to charge me for the transportation? And I can take the table to you, but it's going to cost you an extra $15 for gas. So and it becomes very expensive. Whereas organizations can minimize those transactions costs and provide those products at a very, very low price. Okay. What are some of the sources of transactions costs? We're almost done here. Hang with me for a minute. Some of the sources of transactions costs come from environmental uncertainty, opportunism, which is rent-seeking behavior. Risk is always a driver of transactions costs. This concept of bounded rationality, if you've ever heard of the name Herbert Simon, Dr. Herbert Simon was an economist who wrote about bounded rationality. Bounded rationality means that we as individuals have imperfect information. We don't have all the information in the world. And so we make decisions not maximizing, but rather satisfying. And then also small numbers. Those are sources of transactions costs. And then the last one is specific assets. Things that are not readily available, and so they generate higher transactions costs. Like, for example, the Mona Lisa, right? If you wanted to transport the Mona Lisa, think about the logistics and the cost of transporting that priceless piece of art, right? So it's not the same to transport the Mona Lisa as it is to transport, a set of bowling balls, right? Okay, so sources of transactions costs are several. And I believe we are done. Okay, very good. All right, so I hope that you enjoyed this presentation. It was a little longer than I expected, but then again, it's a long 2 chapters, and I wanted to at least give you some general feedback on each of them, and some cover some general thoughts and concepts, etc. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoy the week. God bless you, and reach out if you have any questions or concerns. Take care.